not by our hidden agenda. You know, thinking about Alaska strategically, and most Americans don't, but let's talk about Alaska just for a minute and how this feeds in to what's happening around the world. Firstly, Alaska is 18% of all the land in the United States. It has a greater coastline, Alaska alone. If you take all the western states, all the west coast, all the east coast, and all the Gulf Coast, and you add it all up, Alaska's coastline is bigger. And we have a 200-mile federal limit in those coastal waters, which is significant. Now, let's look at where Alaska sits on the map. Here's Alaska. Place Alaska just for a moment as if it were the top of the world. And then look at where it sits. North America. Here's LA. The same distance to LA, I hit Japan. The same distance, I hit Northern Europe. Same distance as for me as Alaskan to fly to Tokyo, to LA, or to Oslo. I can get there in virtually the same amount of time from Alaska, which is why Federal Express located their international hub in Anchorage, Alaska, and UPS put their international hub in Fairbanks, Alaska, because they could serve Asia, Europe, and the United States with the shortest distance between points, hubbing out of Alaska. Now, if you think about it, the Aleutian chain, which actually, you can't see it so easily on this, but it comes down right to here, and here's Japan. Okay? So Alaska to Japan is this distance. Alaska, I don't even hit Seattle. I can't get to the next state, but I can get to Japan. Now think about it. Raw materials coming out of Alaska, feeding the Pacific Rim. The best markets are to feed the Asian markets. Now there's no railroad links, so I mentioned yesterday, we can't get from Alaska into the Midwest. If we could link approximately right here at Prince Rupert, if we could link at Prince Rupert to the railroad system in Canada, we could then move Alaskan commodities all the way into the Midwest, the industrial belt, and be able to use those mineral commodities to do value-added and reindustrialize the nation. 1/4 of all the oil and gas left undiscovered in the world exists right here in the Arctic Circle. That's the estimate. Alaska has hundreds of trillions of cubic feet of natural gas. Now think about the North Slope of Alaska, which is right here where our oil and gas is. Now think about us moving oil and gas through an empty Arctic. The Arctic Sea is almost to the point where we can start to move freight from Europe to North America across the pole. Think about it. Instead of bringing freight from Europe to the United States, this distance, 1/3 of the way around the world, we can shorten that distance to 1/4 of its distance and move freight directly in to Northern Europe and into their rail systems, connecting into their commodity flow, or into Russia and Asia, jumping over the poles with our freight, not just in the air, but in the sea. This will change everything and puts Alaska in the most strategic place, because commodities are equal in price no matter where they're produced. The differences then become how cheap is it to get it to the next point. So we need rail to get it into the Midwest of the United States, where then it has the opportunity of being exported off of our western ports or through the St. Lawrence Seaway or off of our eastern ports, or we have the option in the not-too-distant future of shipping direct into these markets, raw goods, or adding value here in Alaska. Alaska has the greatest energy resources. All these minerals require energy for value added, and we have the opportunity to do that now. Now, what would that mean? If we began to move these commodities and these energy resources in the United States, half of our trade deficit is energy related and the other is buying value-added products back from China. If we could eliminate 50% of our trade deficits by eliminating imported energy, we strengthen the dollar again. We reinvigorate our economy again. We now have a domestic supply of energy, and we keep our money rolling in our own economies. The same is true with value added to our commodities. We have an opportunity to take a big chunk of our economy back from the rest of the world, embed it back into our nation, and use the advantage that we have. Alaska is the stepchild. Recognize our state. Recognize this place as an incredible opportunity for Americans to be liberated by looking at the balance sheet. Think about it. We always talk about the profit and loss statement, the income and expenses of the nation when we talk about the debt and how we're going to fix it. And it's always about the taxpayer and putting it on our backs. The balance sheet are the assets of the nation, which includes our energy resources, our mineral wealth, our force, our public lands. How do we make them pay in a way that offsets the Treasury demands against the taxpayer? Get full value for our commodities. Make sure those multinationals pay money here, because here's what happens, and we play it out in Alaska every year. Here we have oil and gas that the nation needs, and we have a pipeline that can run it down to Valdez, and the pipeline is running at 616,000 barrels a day today. It's designed to handle 2.1 million barrels. Why aren't we moving U.S. oil through a U.S. pipeline? Is because it's cheaper to corrupt a third world government somewhere else on the planet, keep the oil and gas in the ground in the U.S., because a multinational doesn't have any care about our national needs or our national priorities. It's about the bottom line. If it were a national oil company that cared first about the national priorities, then that oil and gas would be developed, would be feeding U.S. markets, even if it cost a little more, because the offset is U.S. jobs, U.S. taxes generated, U.S. rollover in our economy of every one of those dollars spent domestically 7 times. A 7 times multiplier in the economy and the tax base when we spend money at home. That's the difference. Bring it back because it's a domestic priority, not a multinational priority. Our domestic priorities need to carry forward, or these companies that are retaining these rights need to be put under performance. You know, these leases on the North Slope don't require any performance. They hold them, they pay the fee, they don't have to ever produce them. In Russia, if you didn't produce, you lost your right. Later they took them anyway, but at least they had the incentive. You're going to spend the money, you're going to produce these fields, or you're out of here. So they did. In the U.S., we don't make them produce anything. We just give them the right to tie up the public resource, call it their safety deposit box in our safe economy, because our men and women are defending this turf to defend them, to save their bacon after we're done trying to save it from whatever third world country they've corrupted. They always can come back home and produce it domestically, and by then they've screwed us down so much on the royalties and taxes under the guise of, well, if it's not cheap enough, we'll do it elsewhere. We understand all that. We know how economics works. We know how capitalism works. But we also understand how our national interests work, and multinational companies don't, because they don't care. It's not in their self-interest to care. They're looking at the 6 billion other consumers that don't live here, who are their potential future markets, because this economy, from their perspective, doesn't have those opportunities. It's dead. They want to go where people are changing from bicycles to automobiles, and that's the rest of the world. People have asked me, about my father. He was lost on a plane with Hale Boggs in the early 70s. Hale was a majority leader at the time. I mean, you can look at all of the interesting coincidences. The guy that took Hale Boggs to the airport, he was working in Texas at the time for another campaign, and Boggs got a ride to the airport by a young Democrat from Oklahoma, William Jefferson Clinton. Yeah, the same one that later became president. Now, this is 1972. Now, Boggs gets on the plane, he goes to D.C., makes a connection to Alaska, comes to Alaska, gives a speech, breaks the story a little bit about what was coming. We didn't know, it wasn't known as Watergate then, it was just this big scandal that he mentioned. And the next day he gets on a plane flying to Juneau from Anchorage and disappears and never heard from him.